June 1948, Moscow. The design bureau has been feverish for a week. This has never happened before. An extremely important state order for drawings is being prepared in great haste. People work overtime, but still, obviously, they will not have time to meet the deadline. And then the management makes an incredible decision to give all the drawings to one employee. But why was it done? Late at night, the office is empty. The young designer got to work and broke away from the drawings only 3 days later. As a result, he coped with the office's weekly workload on his own. The employees were amazed by such unprecedented efficiency, and no one guessed at the expense of what had happened. This man will eventually become the famous Soviet biochemist Lev Osterman. In his autobiography Against the Current, he will talk about this 3-day marathon on Fenamine. It was the most intimate secret of the era of the Soviet Union, the country of records and 5-year awards, the country of an invincible army, strong workers, and champion athletes. A country that said, "We are the best, we will catch up and overtake." And no one knew that many victories in this crazy race were achieved with the help of drugs. See further, a fear pill for Soviet soldiers. What were the penalty battalion soldiers given during the failed operations of World War II? The post-war Stakhanov movement and drugs, happiness in ordinary bread. Psychedelics on the shelves of Soviet pharmacies. What drugs were used to turn Soviet women into men, and what drugs were tested on mental hospital inmates? How did the crazy projects of the secret Kremlin Laboratory No. 13 end? November 1941, Tula region. Fierce battles at the front have been going on for several days. The Red Army suffers defeat after defeat. The Germans have already entered Latvia, Lithuania, Belarus, and are now going to Moscow. Under the onslaught of huge enemy forces, the Soviet troops are retreating. It was at this point that the order came from Moscow: hold back the Germans at all costs. There is nowhere to wait for salvation. The first to go into battle will be the soldiers of the penalty battalion. They will take the worst hit. But how to make them go to certain death? How to convince not to leave the battlefield? Before the night attack, the suicide bombers were lined up. It was noticeable how nervous they were. These people knew their destinies were already decided in advance. They had a few hours left to live. They greedily drank the 100 grams permitted before the battle, knowing full well that alcohol would not save them from the insane fear that completely engulfed them.
But that day the impossible happened. For the first time in the history of combat, Soviet soldiers managed to go on the offensive. They defeated the enemy's forces, which were twice as large. As a result of the battle, with minimal losses, our soldiers managed to destroy an entire tank division and 49 enemy guns. This allowed us to gain time to organize our defense, and the Germans were stopped.
With a sinking heart, the Soviet people listened to the joyful news of the first victory of our troops. and no one knew what the price of this victory was for the winners themselves. That night, the soldiers of the penal battalion, lined up in a line, did not know that only a few hours would pass, and there would be no trace of their fear. They will rush into battle with fury and inexhaustible energy. And the reason for this will be the 100 grams of alcohol allowed before the fight. Or rather, the substance contained in the vodka.
We managed to find out the name of this substance. It turns out that that night, the soldiers were mixed with a substance called Fenamine. It is a powerful stimulant drug or narcotic. With large doses, a person could do without sleep for 10 to 12 days. All her sensations intensified several times. Her vigilance increased. But most importantly, the feeling of fear and pain was dulled. But where did this drug come from on the front lines of World War II?
It is hard to believe, but it was delivered from a closed laboratory in Lubyanka.
Well, these drugs, all psychostimulants, were designed to temporarily increase a person's performance in extreme conditions. For example, amphetamines, which are also psychostimulants, were often developed and used to relieve long-haul pilots of the need to sleep. That is before departure, when it was necessary to spend 20 hours or more in flight continuously, and there was no replacement crew and was not expected. The pilot had to stay awake all this time.
Pervitin, Lubyanka. This man has been lying motionless in the ward for several days. He was brought to the infirmary from the prison cell. After many hours of interrogation, he could hardly feel his body, could not speak or move even a hand. But today everything will be different. He will be given one injection, and the reaction will be unpredictable. In a few minutes, this calm person is overcome with unprecedented aggression. He will forget about the pain, like a madman jumping out of bed. The man seemed to have so much strength that he was ready to break down walls. This is how the first experiments with Fenamine took place, and they were carried out by order of the Soviet government in a secret laboratory near the Kremlin. It was called Special Chemical Laboratory 13.
Indeed, experiments with such substances were carried out in the 30s, and maybe even earlier, when a chemical laboratory was created, or simply a laboratory, as it was called then. It was created in the bowels of the Soviet Special Services. Well, for example, increasing, say, a person's physical capabilities, intellectual abilities, the ability to stay awake for a certain time, which is very important because there are times when it is simply, as they say, necessary. And on the other hand, it is drugs with such a strong effect that can lead to the fact that a person's will is completely suppressed and a person does some incredible things that he might never have done before.
The head of the special department of the NKVD, Arkady Hertsovsky, walked for a long time along the line of refined people in front of him, but he could not choose. He was personally responsible for the selection of healthy prisoners for further experiments, and now he was terribly worried. He had to report on the work done to the top management, including personally to Comrade Beria, who was in charge of this direction. Finally, he selected 5 people. Now these prisoners had only one, but very honorable mission to serve as guinea pigs for the benefit of the state.
Scientists faced the task of creating a new model of a Soviet soldier, hardy, fearless, and tireless. The need for such soldiers appeared from the first days of the war, when the Soviet army suffered significant defeats. It was then that Fenamine first appeared at the front. It would seem that the recipe was found, but no one could predict what an unexpected effect this perfect Soviet fear pill would have.
September 1940, Leningrad. This year, a huge wave of robberies of pharmacy warehouses swept through the city. A special military commission began to investigate the case. The investigators did not hide their surprise. The robbers were interested in pills of a very specific spectrum of action. They were pills with a narcotic effect. But who needed so many drugs and why? The answer appeared completely by accident. In the basement of one of the houses, investigators found a whole box of stolen drugs. Their owner turned out to be a former soldier who had been awarded several orders for bravery. The name of this person has not been preserved, only fragments of testimony remain. But this was enough to understand the real reason for these robberies, which were carried out by former frontline soldiers.
This is how the most important side effect of this phenomenon addiction was actively manifested. That is why drug addiction grew uncontrollably after the war in the country. But the Soviet government was in no hurry to take any measures because drug addiction had to be fought in the Kremlin itself.
Kremlin Hospital, 1940. That day, a new box of ampules was brought to the office of the head physician of the Kremlin Hospital. They were immediately hidden in an iron safe, because these are very valuable medicines for the chosen ones. Within an hour, visitors began to come one by one for these medicines. Each of them received several ampules, and they all immediately locked themselves in their offices. No one could disturb them at this time. These treasured ampules contained morphine, the most popular drug for the elite. A fast and effective painkiller that competed with another drug for the top, cocaine. A favorite drug of Comrade Lenin's entourage.
In the 20s and 30s, the use of cocaine and morphine, especially in the 20s, became a mass phenomenon, especially in the Bolshevik environment, and, by the way, even among diplomats.
1920, Lubyanka. This man almost falls off his chair from fatigue. But the interrogation did not stop. For 2 days now, the head of the emergency commission, Felix Dzerzhinsky, has been trying to extract valuable information from the German spy. The prisoner faints from hunger and insomnia, but Dzerzhinsky looks very cheerful. From time to time, he interrupts to take a new dose of cocaine. Soon the prisoner was taken away, and Dzerzhinsky stayed behind to receive the next one. It was he who introduced the fashion for drugs in the Kremlin, a fashion that reached unprecedented proportions under Joseph Stalin. After the war, with the beginning of a new wave of repression, with the help of cocaine and morphine, most high-ranking officials of the USSR relieved stress.
Such an innocent at first glance machine with the inscription "bread" had a special meaning in those days. In the Stalinist era, political prisoners were transported in such cars. Stalin's entourage lived in constant fear. They were afraid of the leader, afraid of arrests and camps. Yes, life in constant stress gradually turned the Kremlin sky dwellers into true drug addicts.
Among the most famous are two people's commissars of the NKVD, Henry Yagoda and his successor Mykola Yezhov. And also a huge number of ministers who changed quite often under Stalin. How widespread morphine was is evidenced by a note to Pavel Obrosov, head of the Kremlin's Medical and Sanitary Department, dated April 3, 1926, from the secret department of the Central Committee of the CPSU. The note contained a request to create a first aid kit in the department to provide assistance to patients who do not require the participation of a doctor. The application also included huge doses of morphine. Back in the 30s, the drug was considered a privilege of the elite. But the Second World War changed this principle and opened new horizons for future Soviet achievements. Minsk. For the third day, the workers of the machine-building plant did not show up at their workplaces. This was an unprecedented case for the USSR. It was an open protest of workers to the Soviet government, but people were forced to do it. They were not paid wages, they were fed extremely poorly in the local canteen, and in order to draw attention to themselves, the workers stopped production.
And the reaction was not long in coming. The rioting workers were arrested. But the Kremlin realized that such a situation could be repeated in other plants or factories. After all, the problem of food shortages and salary delays was global. A wave of mass popular uprisings could start overnight. Therefore, it was necessary to prevent discontent at all costs. And they found a solution.
Despite the terrible consequences of taking Fenamine, they did not think of giving up the drug. After all, then, in the situation of post-war devastation, a Superman was needed again, strong, hardy, able to work around the clock, continuously, without knowing fatigue. Now the task is to exceed the production plan, to complete the 5-year plan in 3 years by any means necessary. And a new little-known drug in the USSR until now, Pervitin. This drug was taken by German soldiers on the front lines of the Second World War.
Pervitin became a systemic product in the first aid kits of both SS and Wehrmacht soldiers. What is known is that this actually contradicted one of the main theses of Nazi ideology, which stated that a person should lead a healthy lifestyle and not use any harmful substances. In this case, to some extent, the initial success of Nazi Germany was also due to the fact that Pervitin helped to increase the fighting capacity of the German troops.
According to preliminary information, Pervitin showed itself much better than Fenamine. The effect of this drug was longer, and the efficiency was higher. This should have been checked by Soviet scientists. pseudo-success, Lubyanka. The members of the Special Commission gathered in the prison yard from the very morning. For 5 hours now, they have been watching in amazement as the prisoner runs circles around the playground without stopping. The results exceeded all expectations. The prisoner seemed to have forgotten where he was. The experiment lasted more than 10 hours. The members of the commission went to bed, and the prisoner did not show a hint of fatigue. After this experience, experts agreed on one thing: the perfect stimulant, a substitute for Fenamine, had been found. But to whom was it intended? It's hard to believe, but after successful trials, the drug was put into mass use. Now anyone could make a miracle drug at home if they wanted to. Information about him was publicly available. Moreover, drugs were actively advertised. Thus, in the Journal of General Chemistry, which anyone could buy, it is described in detail how to synthesize Fenamine and Pervitin from improvised drugs.
Here is the recipe. Everything is clearly described here. Pour glacial acetic acid into a round-bottomed flask. Then you need to add a little red phosphorus there. This is how the process of drug synthesis begins. The ingredients for Pervitin could be obtained at any pharmacy. For those who could not master a simple recipe, pharmacies offered a ready-made drug.
1951 Moscow. In this pharmacy, Pervitin is actively recommended as a means of boosting immunity. And it is sold out very quickly. Almost every visitor takes a pack, regardless of what medicine they came for. Pervitin is recommended by doctors and pharmacists themselves, and gullible people willingly buy it.
Fenamine, Pervitin, as well as intoxicating tincture for stomach colic. The pharmacy of those days was a real drug addict's dream. And what is most interesting, all these drugs could be bought without a prescription and quite inexpensively. Until 1968, when these drugs were classified as narcotic and prohibited for widespread use.
In the meantime, these drugs have an important mission: to create a new model of the Soviet superworker, a person who can work even harder, even faster for the benefit of the motherland and the Soviet leaders. And the management plan worked. Production at the factories and plants was restored in record time. However, it was not without losses. Pervitin, Saratov. Local hospitals are full of people, brought in en masse directly from their workplaces. Doctors worked without rest, but were unable to make a diagnosis. There had never been such a case in Soviet medicine. Something incredible happened to the patients. They had fever, febrile delirium, loss of consciousness. The situation became more and more serious, and the hospital management reported a strange epidemic to Moscow. But the reaction was unpredictable. An order comes from the Kremlin to Saratov to assume that all this was caused by ordinary overwork. But was it really so? What happened to these people?
Only at the beginning of the 90s did scientists manage to shed light on that mysterious event. It turns out that the strange epidemic was the result of long-term use of Pervitin. Nervous breakdown, aggression, sudden increase in temperature, paranoia. And this is far from a complete list of side effects.
Because this kind of drug has a downside. This is our physical fatigue. You start to get tired very quickly, I emphasize, very quickly. And those activities, which used to be enough for rest, are not enough for you. Roughly speaking, you've eaten well, you seem to feel good, you're not injured, so you're a perfectly healthy person. But instead of 6 or 7 hours of hard work, you can only do, say, 2 hours, or even an hour. This is the payback for drug use.
The Soviet leadership carefully hushed up this fact, but measures were taken, and conditions at work did not improve. People's salaries did not increase either. Store shelves were still short of the most necessary products, but people no longer rioted, demanding the attention of the authorities. Maybe because they were afraid of arrests, or maybe because they no longer saw the need for it, because they felt quite satisfied with their standard of living. And as it turned out, with good reason. 1955 year. A long queue formed in the bread shop on the outskirts of the city from the very morning. People were anxious, jostling, trying to squeeze closer to the counters. They took several loaves of bread at once, and the entire daily supply of bread was sold out in a matter of hours. But what was the reason for such excitement, if there was no shortage of bread in the country? It is incredible, but at that time a small amendment was made to the generally accepted GOSTs. Some bakeries were advised to add a special drug to the flour.
We managed to find a unique recipe for this bread. So in those days, bread was made like this: dry yeast, wheat flour, rye malt, and 30 grams of hemp flours. Scientists have found that in small doses, this drug promotes the production of endorphin, the hormone of happiness, in the human body. And it was this drug that successfully fed the Soviet population for several months.
It is not known what worked better, the drug in the bread, or the time during which people's lives gradually began to improve. It was in the 1950s that the labor and demographic indicators of the Soviet people increased in the USSR. At the same time, the Soviet country began to confidently dominate world sports. Already after the debut Olympics, our athletes brought home 77 medals. The results were amazing, but few people knew that the key to this success was not always excellent health and good physical training of athletes. (1956 year, Moscow). That day, a group of Soviet gymnasts was returning from European competitions in the team bus. The girls were triumphant, an unprecedented success. They won 5 medals at once. The athlete was greeted as a heroine. However, they achieved victory at a terrible price. This inhuman way was more effective than any doping. In order to achieve the best sports results, female athletes were forced to get pregnant and have an abortion before the competition.
According to the theory of the people who proposed this manipulation, during an abortion, a hormonal restructuring of the female body takes place. More male sex hormones appear in a woman's body, which in this case is the key to further sports achievements.
It was the strongest natural drug, better than any synthetic drugs and doping. It is 3 times more effective because it was produced by the human body. However, this method could be used infrequently, and certainly not for everyone. But Soviet women were impressive not only in the sports arena. 1960 year, Ryazan, 5 o'clock in the morning. Tractor driver Maria Stepanova carries sacks of grain on her shoulders. One bag of grain weighs 20 kilograms, and she does not seem to feel tired. Today she has to work 2 shifts. Surprisingly, it has been working in this mode for a week. Maria will receive a medal as the best employee. During the ceremony, she will be asked to share a secret, and Maria will tell him. Healthy sleep, work, and means to increase immunity.
It would seem that there is nothing wrong with this, except for this supposedly harmless immune system booster, methandrostenol. This drug appeared in the USSR as a doping agent for athletes. But the drug was produced in such quantities that not only professional athletes began to use it. Moreover, in those days, it was actively prescribed to women as a common medicine to raise their overall tone.
This was the secret of a real Soviet woman. She must be physically strong to replace a man at the machine. Must be hardy, able to work tirelessly for two. And methandrostenol should help her in this, which gradually turned women into real men in the literal sense of the word.
This is a drug that affects the metabolism. It is similar to male sex hormones, so it helps to build muscle mass. What happens to a woman who takes male hormones? Can you imagine her hair grows in places that are not typical for a woman? Secondary sexual characteristics disappear, breasts decrease, voice becomes coarser. She will begin to look like a man, while genetically remaining a woman, that is, having two X chromosomes. She will nevertheless begin to masculinize, that is, to resemble a man in appearance.
Apparently, Soviet scientists knew about these side effects. Methandrostenol was quietly and unnoticed withdrawn from pharmacies. But the crazy drug experiments did not end there. In the 60s, the USSR discovered a new powerful drug, LSD. April 1962, Chita. That morning, the clinic was full of excitement. A new drug was delivered from Switzerland that interested the hospital's chief psychiatrist. So today he decided to test this new product personally. Late at night, when everyone had left, he shut himself in his study and took LSD. And after a few minutes, he fully felt its effect. It was this man who was the first in the USSR to start experiments with LSD. His name was Grigory Stolyarov. Here is how he describes his impressions of taking the drug. After an hour, I had a slight tremor in my hands and an irresistible desire to laugh, although I did not feel any joyful feeling. It became more difficult to record. The hand seems to speed up the movement by itself. You have to forcefully hold your own hand. Within 30 minutes, my condition changed. I felt an indefinite sensation, chills, nausea, and general weakness. Kiev professor Maria Teleshivska also became interested in the new drug. She became its most active researcher and believed that it should be used. But she saw LSD as a cure for alcoholism. In 1964, her doctoral dissertation on narcopsychotherapy was officially published by the Soviet publishing house Medicine. However, as a result of research, cases of psychosis and suicidal moods were recorded. Therefore, experiments with LSD had to be stopped.
LSD was used to a limited extent for one reason. It is very difficult to predict its effect. You think that you are giving LSD to a patient to solve a small therapeutic problem. But this can cause a prolonged psychosis in a person, and it is already necessary to treat the patient for schizophrenia. Although it will be a man-made psychosis and created by you yourself.
During the Khrushchev thaw, experiments with drugs ceased to be so massive, but were still carried out. Many drugs were under development, and for new psychotropic drugs, new experimental rabbits were needed. Here are these, silent and submissive. They were found they were Soviet dissidents.
At that time, the number of detainees in Lubyanka was significantly reduced. Now those who disagreed with the authorities were sent to psychiatric hospitals, where they became ideal working material for new experiments. (1971), Kazan, a prison psychiatric hospital. The dissidents did not want to cooperate with the investigation and testify. They didn't even understand what they were guilty of, but they realized one thing: to admit their guilt, to sign confessions to non-existent crimes, would mean staying here forever. They did not know only one thing: how the necessary information would be obtained from them. The doctors of the clinic crowded around the man tied to the chair. The patient was injected with something. A few minutes later, the man, who had been stubbornly silent for a month, felt very dizzy and then started to speak. This was one of many experiments with the so-called truth serum. These experiments were called interviews with Amital.
In a 1973 manual on psychiatry for dissidents, Soviet dissidents Bukovsky and Gluzman wrote about pharmacological interrogation, or interviews with Amital. Intravenous administration of Amital causes a state quite similar to alcohol intoxication. There is a very simple principle at work. A drunkard's tongue gets loose, he starts talking and cannot stop. After all, he tells everything that they wanted to hear from him.
However, this was not the most dangerous experiment that Soviet doctors conducted on patients. There were even scarier ones. For example, an experiment with the drug haloperidol. It is used in psychiatry as a remedy for nervous disorders.
When it comes to a seriously ill patient with severe psychosis, these disorders can be put up with, because this person is dangerous to himself and others. But if we assume that the same drug is administered to a person who has disapproved of the political regime, then she will not have a therapeutic effect from this drug, because she did not have psychosis, right? A person does not have delusions or hallucinations, but he will have side effects: lethargy, muscle stiffness, lack of adequate facial expressions, sluggish mental processes.
With the help of this drug, Soviet doctors wanted to study the limits of the human body, to investigate what the body is capable of during the excessive use of haloperidol. It is not known how long these experiments lasted in the hospital, but the Russian writer Natalia Gorbanevska, who tested the effect of the drug on herself, told about it for the first time. In 1975, she left the hospital and emigrated abroad. And only there she dared to tell about what actually happened in Soviet mental hospitals. A huge scandal erupted in the world, and the trials with haloperidol had to be stopped. However, not because of public outrage, but the absence of tangible results.
Why do we study human experiments conducted in Nazi Germany, Japan, and other such places? It's because these were the countries that were defeated. The fate of psychoactive substances in the Soviet Union remains unclear. Not only does Russia's FSB continue to guard secrets, but so does Ukraine's SBU, both preserving the mysteries of a country that no longer exists.
According to the official account, covert research and experiments involving narcotic substances ceased by the end of the 70s. However, the materials from Secret Kremlin's Special Chemical Laboratory, number 13, remain classified even after 2 decades since the dissolution of the USSR. Following the dissolution of the nation, the archives of Lubyanka were transferred to the FSB, along with the secret recipes of the most remarkable Soviet achievements.